Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Alex Upitis. I'll be outlining some of the key aspects that are worthy of consideration when preparing an emergency or a disaster waste management plan. And as Marcel said, our experience comes from that project with Wollongong City Council, where we wanted to provide council with a coordinated approach to the recovery of waste following a natural disaster event, instead of what was typically a more ad hoc, reactive type scenario that they would normally undertake. So, oops. One of those buttons. Oh, okay. So this is the aftermath of the Yalu Fire in WA, which in 2016 destroyed 181 homes and actually killed 2 people. So as you can see there, there's a fair bit of waste created, including waste that contains a fair bit of asbestos. So a coordinated and efficient waste collection following an event like this reduces the public health risk, but also assists in getting the council and the community back to normal as quickly as possible. So an emergency in New South Wales is defined by the State Emergency and Rescue Management Act. And bear with me here, I'm just going to read through it. It means an emergency due to an actual or imminent occurrence, such as fire, flood, storm, earthquake, explosion, accident, epidemic, or warlike action. So typically your natural disaster will fall into that category, which endangers the safety or health of persons and or destroys or damages property, being an emergency which requires a significant and coordinated response. And so when an emergency occurs and a significant quantity of waste is generated, it requires the council to then provide additional waste management services beyond their business as usual. And so the idea of the emergency waste management plan is to provide that coordinated guidance in that scale of event. And so throughout this presentation, I'll discuss some concepts which I think should definitely be considered when preparing a plan like this. So the first task would be to create a set of objectives which are tailored to your council. And that could be relating to your area, the location, the climate, that kind of thing, what the risks are involved with your location. So in Wollongong, there's a tsunami risk. Obviously, there's not that risk in Dubbo. So it's got to be a sensible set of objectives. But as a minimum, I would include these. So that the plan is easily enacted and implemented, that it facilitates safe, efficient and sustainable waste management, that it diverts waste from landfill as far as possible, but that it also supports existing plans such as external emergency services plans, management plans, and also other internal business continuity plans. And it was also important to understand when you would actually implement the plan. What is that clear marker or guide that says, all right, let's implement it now? Because, so activation thresholds were considered because it provides that clear guidance to council officers, but it also provides guidance to upper management, mayor, councillors who typically, may jump in early and say that everyone can have free tipping at the landfill and it's just open slather and there's no real control. So we wanted to sort of provide some guidance in that area as well. So these thresholds could be based on the business as usual factor, whether or not an emergency services have declared a disaster. So, initially you can maintain the services as best you can. You may not implement the plan, but then if it is beyond business as usual for the council, you can partially or fully implement the plan depending on the scale of the disaster or whether or not a declaration has been made by emergency services. It was also important to consider the roles and responsibilities at the early stage, and this is of staff, of contractors, how they interact with each other, how they interact with emergency services teams. Who are the key contacts, who reports to who talks to the media, things like that. And so if we know the key stakeholders, then it is critical so that we can, notify those people. So we notify management, we get the contractors mobilised, emergency services coordinated with, we notify the community, notify the regulators. So if you decide that it's time to implement the plan, well, the plan then needs to be prepared in such a way that it is practical and methodical. It needs to be clear and concise. It needs to be quite a simple document, but it also needs to be flexible so that it can respond to different circumstances, i.e. different types of emergencies or disasters. The responsibilities need to be known by everyone involved, and there needs to be constant and clear communication throughout the process. And so we looked at creating a methodical approach, which is shown there in the flow diagram, which contains waste generation to start, available facilities, collection approach, processing and treatment, and then the closure of those temporary facilities. I'll discuss those further in the presentation. But also communication. So like I said, it is critical. And throughout the process, it really needs to continue to show how it integrates with emergency services, how the contractors are engaged with, how you coordinate with the neighbouring councils, because obviously it's likely that the disaster isn't just affecting you guys. So, and then how do you provide updates to your community, to the regulator, all the stakeholders who are involved. So the first phase would be to implement the plan, but then to understand the waste generation. And so what this does is it determines the likely quantity and the waste types that are generated from the event. What area is required to store that quantity of material, and then does the council itself have sufficient capacity to actually store that material? So we created a waste generation model to do this, and by looking at a range of different case studies and waste and debris generation calculators, we created a useful tool which could be utilised in conjunction with GIS spatial mapping data to understand the likely types of waste generated by a certain event in a certain area. And so this means that the model could be utilised in real time. So it could calculate the tonnes of waste generated based on a known emergency event, its characteristics and its location, the affected area. And following this, then the model spits out the likely types of waste, the volumes of those waste and recyclables as well, the area required to store that material, all based on adopted densities and compaction ratios and that kind of thing for different types of events. So if it's a flood, then obviously a lot of the material will be more saturated, so there's a greater density in that material. And then this provides an indication of the number of facilities that you need to store that material. So you need to know that so that you can do some processing, some sorting of the material before, or hopefully to prevent it going to landfill at all. So when the amount of waste is known, you then really need to start your collection options and understand which one would be the best approach. And so you would look at, the more typical bulk curbside collections where everyone puts it on the verge. It's unsightly, it's health risk, but it can be the quickest way of doing it. You can also look at the curbside MGB collections, but then also potentially allowing the community to do some collections of their own at their own premises, or those who may want to help out the community, and they can take wastes and recyclables to designated facilities. But there can be issues with that, so if you decide to let the community do that, there needs to be clear communication throughout, so that there aren't any confusion caused by long delays, or it sort of can become quite complex if there's community members running all over the area trying to collect waste, but they don't know where they're taking it, and so there needs to be some control over how that's done. It is also important to note that you should try and use your collection contractor if possible. They can greatly assist in speeding up the collection of waste and recyclables, but you would need to have the right conditions and clauses in your collection contract to, facilitate that. So that's probably worth noting as in your next collection contract, just some sort of ability to provide additional collections in an emergency like this. But also consideration of the timing of collections. It is important that those worst affected areas are targeted first, that the resources are focused in those areas, and then they can then be used later on to collect or assist with the cleanup in areas which aren't as badly affected. But also, what else affects the timing of collections is obviously the types of waste, and it is important to prioritise the hazardous materials first, because they're a public health risk, then move on to the more putrescible wastes, and while leaving the inert materials to last. But hazardous wastes are typically managed by specialist contractors who are licensed to do so. So it's definitely important to engage them very early on in the piece in the implementation of the plan, so that they're on ground first and they're securing, identifying any hazardous material. It is also worth noting that if there's a substantial volume of water involved, it's flooding, it's heavy rain, then certain materials can become quite saturated and become putrid far more quickly than maybe typically expected, so they would then become a higher priority when collecting the waste. But in contrast, if council has enough available area to dry certain wastes, such as vegetative wastes, then that can be done over a period of time, and it can actually reduce your gate fee costs if you're taking it to a composter or a recycler, because the volume or the weight in the back of the truck is actually going to be less because you've allowed it to dry. So that's also a good approach if you've got that ability, that available space. So once it is all collected, then where does it go? So the plan should outline the available facilities that are within close proximity to the emergencies to allow for that sorting, storing, consolidating of the recyclables and the waste materials. So, but for the purpose of this, an emergency, these sites are typically temporary. So instead of calling them temporary material stockpiling and sorting sites, we refer to them as emergency management facilities, which was a more general name, and it sort of implied that they could be used for other things, not just waste management, so in case of a response. So that could mean that emergency services are using the sites as well as waste management. It just doesn't mean that it's designated to that purpose. And there's a preference that these sites are council-owned, and also hopefully like a waste management facility that may have leachate control, may have drainage control. So there could be a current or former site, like a closed landfill site, or they could be council-owned depots. But you would need to still have a set of contingency sites up your sleeve in case there is far too much waste generated to stockpile. And these secondary sites would be sports ovals, car parks, public open space, things like that. So by utilising the waste generation model and the GIS data, it can be determined that the emergency management facilities have the required storage capacity, are available and can be accessed, and are not actually impacted by the event itself. It's also recommended that the plan provides some sort of guidance on the simple site layouts of these facilities, so like a one-directional loop with stockpiling areas, so that it's quite simple setup, simple closure. What's required to prepare the sites for material acceptance, if there needs to be hard stands, that kind of thing. And then what are the operational procedures? So the operations need to be relatively simple, because in an emergency, typically all hands are on deck, and you may have a counsellor running the gate who has no operational experience. So what we did is we broke it into the three simple phases there, which you can see: waste acceptance, waste handling and processing, and the transfer of waste. And so it was important that the staff manning the site knew where that material was going. We didn't want potentially recyclable material going straight to landfill, obviously. So we really wanted them to know to direct transporters that waste or recycling material can go be reprocessed. And that could be at a composter, inert recycler, hazardous treatment facility, and landfill as last resort. But there needs to be clear and simple site procedures, and they need to be prepared and included in the plan. So that allows there to be efficient and consistent management of the site. And this can be done through written or computerised checklists and templates, which can obviously then be used by anyone from a labourer, councillor, GM. Anyone can actually run the gate or run the site if need be. And so after the emergency, and the cleanup may take weeks, months, years, it's at this point that we actually want to return these temporary sites to their previous state. And this means we need to remove all the wastes, all the recyclable stockpiles, any infrastructure that's been established at the site, then all needs to go. But it also needs to be done to a suitable standard. So we recommend that some sort of inspection is undertaken by council to do this, to ensure that it has been potentially remediated if it needs to be. But then also discuss this with the regulator. Are they happy? Because they'll be particularly interested in the closure of these sites. Like seeking their input throughout the implementation, and then obviously the closure of these sites, will ensure that they are done to a suitable standard and done in accordance with any necessary requirements, such as legislative requirements. So, in conclusion, the development of a practical, simple and methodical emergency waste management plan, combined with a waste generation model and some GIS data, will provide councils the guidance to undertake a coordinated waste recovery in the event of an emergency or a disaster event. And this proactive approach can reduce the public health risk, it can manage the waste more effectively, and divert recoverable and recyclable materials from landfill. And I'd just like to thank Wollongong City Council for getting Talis on board to undertake this interesting project, and New South Wales EPA as it was funded through Waste Less, Recycle More. Thank you.